Hey y'all, I got a confession to make. Once upon a time, I was a freaking doormat. Okay, that's actually being a little generous if I'm honest. I wasn't just a doormat. I was basically a talking doormat that thanked you for stepping on it. I was so obsessed with making the people around me happy that I never really stopped to think about whether I was happy. And not only that, I never said no to doing favors for people, and it didn't matter how big or small they were. I was like yes, yes, yes to what other people wanted, even if the people who were asking me for those things were treating me really poorly. It's been a long process breaking those habits, but in today's episode, I wanted to talk about what I learned along the way, and to be honest about what happened when I stopped being a people pleaser. Some of it's a little surprising. So the first thing I learned when I recovered was that you don't become a people pleaser overnight. Instead, it's this long, gradual process. I hadn't just been one for years, I'd been one for decades. I didn't just wake up one day as a people pleaser. I had this long history of putting myself in these situations where I was doing things that made me unhappy, but saying yes anyway. And then once I started to get better, I woke up and I had this aha moment on the other side of things. And I realized suddenly that I had built this life around me that was not serving me, was not good for me. When this happened, I realized I was almost completely surrounded by people who weren't treating me well. It's like, oh no, oh no. The next thing I learned is when you find yourself in this situation, you have to fight one battle at a time. So when you realize that you should be setting boundaries and what healthy boundaries are, you are suddenly tasked with renegotiating the boundaries with every single person in your life, because you have a whole life that's full of all this really unhealthy relating with people. So once your eyes have been open to it, it's really tempting to go on this big boundary setting campaign to essentially start setting boundaries with everybody over every little thing all the time, because your world has been flipped upside down. Up is down, down is up. It's like, oh gosh, it's actually a very natural reaction to realizing you're being taken for granted as you want to go on this boundary setting campaign with everybody over every little thing. But it's actually best to resist that urge because it's stressful to recover from these things and you're still building up your skills. Instead, it's better to focus on one thing at a time. So you'll have one relationship that's very important and you need to focus on that, and to focus on the specific ways that it's not working for you. And the reason you need to do this is you need to pace yourself so you don't burn out because you are still building your skills. There will come a point where it becomes very easy for you and then you can go a little faster, but in the beginning especially, you need to focus on just little baby steps. There's this great saying that one of my friends says a lot. He says, Paige, how do you eat an elephant? How do you take on this giant task, right? This impossible task? And the answer to how you eat an elephant is one bite at a time. Same thing with a set of stairs. You do one step at a time. You don't jump up the whole staircase. Same thing with boundary setting. Start small, get better, move through methodically, and before you know it, you'll have renegotiated everything, you'll be in a much better place. So on a similar note, when you're learning assertiveness, you want to start with small things. Because if you're a people pleaser, it's not just the big things you're compromising on, it's a lot of the small things. And it's actually, frankly, a lot easier to go along with those little things that don't bother you so much. And even if you don't find that these little concessions are causing problems all by themselves, if you get into that habit, you'll find yourself staying quiet about the big things too. So part of reversing the process is starting to reverse the small things. So as an example, your first act of assertiveness, if you're recovering from being a people pleaser, is not marching into your boss's office and demanding a long overdue raise. It's not doing that. It might be something instead like being at a restaurant and the waiter bringing you the wrong food and you politely pointing it out and asking to get what you ordered. Like, it's good to start small. The next thing I learned when I recovered from people pleasing is something that I had all wrong back when I was having trouble with it. And that is that setting boundaries isn't about telling other people what to do. Setting boundaries with other people isn't bossy. It's not selfish to set boundaries. Boundaries communicate what you are and you aren't okay with. It's not telling the other person what they need to do because of that. So with boundaries, you express what you need and how you react to things, and other people get to decide what they want to do with that information. So what does that look like? Well, I'll give you an example. So saying something like, you need to pay me back for the money I loaned you, is not setting a boundary. That's telling somebody else what to do. I mean, maybe it's justified, but it's not boundary setting. Instead, here's an example of a boundary. I'm sorry, but I won't be loaning you money ever again until you pay me back. Simple. It states what you will do what you are and aren't okay with. It's all about your actions. The next thing I learned when I recovered from being a people pleaser is that boundaries are very individual. Boundaries actually vary a lot from person to person. What you might want or need might seem unreasonable to somebody else, and vice versa. It's not a right or wrong thing. This isn't Jeopardy. This is about our wants, our needs. Just because your personal boundaries are different from somebody else's, it doesn't make them silly or wrong. And it doesn't make you silly or wrong for having them. Sometimes when I talk about this, people are like, well, okay, but what's reasonable? It's all relative. But here are some common examples of boundaries that most people won't tolerate, just to kind of get you started thinking about it. Most people have an expectation that they won't be called names or blamed for things that aren't their fault. Another one is that you are able to request space from other people when you need it. So something like in an argument, be like, hey, I need 5 minutes. I'm going to go for a walk. I'm going to come back and think about it. That's a very common, reasonable boundary. And if somebody's chasing you saying, no, you can't go for 5 to 10 minutes, that's generally considered less reasonable. Those are generally considered mentally healthy. But again, everybody's a little different. Some people might not need that time and space to discuss. Another thing I learned was that when you first set boundaries after being a people pleaser for years and years, you will feel like you're shouting. When you start asserting yourself for the first time, it can actually be a scary experience. If you're used to agreeing with other people and going along with whatever they want, any sort of disagreement that you voice will sound very harsh coming out of your mouth. Something simple like, no thanks, or I'm sorry, but I need to set a boundary around that. I'm not comfortable, can actually feel to you in the recovery stage like you're shouting at people at full volume. Rest assured, you're probably fine. I found that people who recover from people pleasing are typically very kind when they think they are shouting, and unless you're losing your voice or people are cowering, you probably are fine. You probably haven't overcorrected in the other direction, but I get it. I felt like I was shouting my face off when I first started to be assertive. The next thing I learned, this was very difficult. This was a very, very, very difficult consequence of recovering from people pleasing. I would say this is one of the hardest parts. Some people get really angry when you start saying no to them. And especially coupled with the bit about feeling like you're shouting, this can be really challenging for people who are in recovery from being dependent, being people pleasers. And the reason for this is that people pleasers, by the time they get into recovery, are usually surrounded by people who are accustomed to always hearing yes from the people pleaser. And when you start to change and work on assertiveness, this change can be really stressful for people who are used to you being a doormat, who want you to be a doormat, and frankly, sometimes who are trying to keep you being a doormat. This isn't going to be the case for everybody you know. Sometimes people will roll with it. I have plenty of people that were my friends before assertiveness therapy that are still my friends after. They're very happy for me. We actually get closer. But other people, not so much. But that's okay. And the next thing I learned explains why. And that is that setting boundaries helps you learn who really cares about you. So this is a funny thing. People seem all alike so long as you're saying yes to what they want. When you never set any boundaries or needs of your own, it's very funny how similar they all can seem when you're giving people what they want, when you never have any needs of your own. And frankly, it's only when you start to say no to people that you learn about who really cares about you. People who care about you can usually accept a reasonable no, especially when it's something important to you. But selfish people become very agitated very fast. And I'm telling you, it is stressful when this starts to happen. And it can be really disappointing. It can be really heartbreaking when you learn a friend who you thought really cared about you actually doesn't. But once you get over that initial shock, it is really valuable information to know, because the only way that you're going to be surrounded by a good support network and people who really care about you is if you're not monopolized by these selfish actors. And that really feeds in well into the next thing I learned, which is that saying no frees you up to focus on things that are more important to you. Like, it's just reality. When you start saying no to things that you don't want, you free up the time, the money, the energy put into things that you do want. This can be self-care or doing things that you enjoy, that you've waylaid because you're too busy helping other people and putting your needs aside. Or it could be focusing on other people in your life who really deserve more attention. And now that you've stood up for yourself, you'll be able to tell the difference between people who care about you and people who only care about what you can do for them. And the final thing I learned about people pleasing, and really the biggest thing that happened, was that you never want to go back. I didn't want to go back. you couldn't pay me to go back. The transition was rough. There was a lot of work to be done on myself and the relationships in my life, but it's night and day. It's so much better now that I am doing things that nurture my soul. I have supportive people in my corner. I don't have leeches and mooches and haters and selfish people who wanted me as their puppet. Like, those people are gone. Don't get me wrong, I still like to take care of people who are close to me, but the big difference now is I am done making huge sacrifices for people who are extremely selfish and aren't willing to ever give anything back and who don't really care about me. Yeah, it was scary to start saying no to people, but I can tell you it was the best decision I ever made, and all the hard work was worth it. As a final note, I think that this also pertains to being a creator in a way. So if you're trying to be everything to everyone, if you're trying to be a people pleaser in a content creator sense, it's really hard to find the people that are your people, right? And it's also a way to be unhappy and burnt out. And I think that it can be difficult to build an authentic audience to deal with saying no to this or that, but that effort is also worth it. Something to keep in mind, whether it's a personal or professional thing for you. It's good to make people happy, but there's a point where it becomes unhealthy people pleasing, and I think that you'll know that that's the inflection point, figuring that out, how to be assertive and be yourself while being there for other people. Anyway, it was great talking to you as always. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.